You're listening to the Summer Series, the best of Business Essentials Daily. Today's episode is brought to you by Mazars. SoundCartel. Do you know who your customers are? Sure, you may have segmented by demographics like sex, age, or earning capacity, but is this traditional approach really enough? From SoundCartel, I'm Nicole Goodman, and this is Business Essentials Daily. These days, we don't fall neatly into categories, if we ever did. The sexes don't follow traditional paths or interests. Many people in their 60s are feeling 20 years younger, and it's getting harder to differentiate the online and offline worlds. Consumer behaviour expert Michael Solomon has recognised these disappearing demographic dichotomies, as he calls them, in his new book, The New Chameleons: How to Connect with Consumers Who Defy Categorisation. Michael is Professor of Marketing at the Horb School of Business in Philadelphia and regularly commentates on consumer issues on American television, including CNN, Good Morning America and The Today Show. Michael says marketers sell vertically, but customers buy horizontally. What does he mean by that? Michael explains to Chris Ashmore.
It's natural for us, no matter what business you're in, you're always looking vertically. In other words, you're looking at other people in your narrow industry and benchmarking yourself to what they're doing and to what those brands are doing. And so if you manufacture, let's say, lamps, you're very concerned about what other lamp makers are doing. Consumers, on the other hand, really don't care what your market share is in that industry. When I say they buy horizontally, what I mean is that as a consumer, you're looking for products that fit together. So let's stay with that lamp example. If you go to buy a lamp, you're thinking not only about putting light in the room, but you're thinking about how it matches with other elements, let's say in your living room, like a couch and a chair and a table and carpeting and so on. And so you're actually looking across many, many different verticals at the same time. And so that perspective is really very valuable for marketers that understand that. They understand that a big reason that people choose a product is not just because of how it works and even how it looks, let's say, but also how it's harmonizing with other things that they're also trying to acquire. So vertical versus horizontal, two very different perspectives.
In that sense, do business owners, do they get fixated too much on what they produce and not on what their potential customers actually want?
Well, I totally believe that that's true. You know, my mantra is that we don't buy things because of what they do. We buy them because of what they mean. And so if you get fixated on the attributes of your product, you lose sight of the benefits of your product. And that is a very different thing. The benefits are what people are looking to get out of the product. So there's a kind of a time-worn saying in the marketing field, but it's worth repeating, which is that a company sells a 3/4-inch drill bit, but a consumer buys a 3/4-inch hole. And that's a good reminder. There may be a better way to get that hole. You know, maybe somebody invents a laser beam that drills through the wood very quickly. So there have been many cases in marketing of companies that were too short-sighted because they didn't understand what business they were in. So the railroads, for example, the companies way back in about 100 years ago, the companies here in the U.S. that thought they were in the railroad business quickly ran into trouble as other ways to get around, like cars, were invented. So they didn't understand that they're actually in the transportation business. And when you reframe what business you're in that way, it really helps you to move away from that trap of just focusing on attributes.
Well, in your book, Michael, you write about different types of segmentations, and one of the biggest ones that we hear about is generational, and the buying habits of, say, baby boomers versus millennials. What's wrong with that thinking?
Well, there's nothing wrong with it. I mean, it's a great place to start. Obviously, teenagers are different from senior citizens in many cases, but again, as I talk about it in the book, these are categories that were convenient when we were not able to really drill down and talk to people as individuals. And so when you think about a broad category like millennials or Gen X or baby boomers, to assume that everyone in that category, and that's a vast number of people, are going to respond similarly is probably not the best way to go about it. And especially in today's culture, things are changing so rapidly, and age is one of those things that is very subjective. Even though we have a chronological age that is not subjective, you're only as old as you feel, right? I'm sure you've heard that expression. And so it really makes a lot more sense to focus on how old people feel rather than how old they actually are. And so we hear a lot, about 80 being the new 60 and 60 being the new 40. And on the other hand, we have a lot of younger people who consume a lot like older people. I mean, they grow up much quicker than they used to. And so those boundaries aren't nearly as useful as they used to be. So it's not that we want to throw them out entirely, but we don't want to get hemmed in by those and just be defined by a chronological age. That's a big mistake.
Mm-hmm. Well, not just the age difference or the segmentation of different generations, but another one you look at is male versus female. And it's obvious, but it's no longer a choice between blue and pink anymore, is it?
Definitely not. That's one of the biggest changes that we're seeing, I think, in different ways around the world, depending on the culture, obviously. But we used to assume that you either fit into one bucket or the other, and if not, there was something strange about you. But of course, today, gender is a very, very subjective thing. So, our gender is biological, obviously, what we're born with, but psychologically, the way we identify is quite different than that. And so it's really much more about a continuum that's anchored by traditional male and traditional female, but lots of movement in the middle. And again, companies that understand that are going to be able to open a lot of doors because they're going to be able to, for example, expand the market for products that traditionally are only suited to one gender or another. So one example I think is interesting. We don't see it so much here in the States. I'm not sure about in Australia yet, but I know in the UK, for example, a lot of men apparently are buying cosmetics. And there are stores that sell cosmetics only for males. And so that's a beautiful business decision because if you're a traditional cosmetics maker, by definition, half of the population has been off the table for you, and suddenly they're back on. And so by understanding that, these traditional categories really are arbitrary and are subject to change, what I stress in the book is that that's not a bad thing. It can be a challenge, but it creates an enormous amount of opportunities when you free yourself from those categories.
Well, another blurring is the offline and the online consumer behavior. How has the World Wide Web changed the way we consume?
How hasn't it changed the way we consume? In the old days, 10 years ago or 15 years ago, of course, we all went online, some of us more than others, but you were very conscious of whether you were online or offline. And there was a literal transition going from one to the other. For people today, especially younger people, that transition doesn't make sense because they are constantly online and offline. In other words, they could be talking to another person face to face, but at the same time, they're texting, they're checking their Facebook page, etc. I know my students in my lectures are doing that probably. And so what that means is that rather than making the strategic decision, should we be online or should we be offline, that question is no longer relevant in an era where both of those are happening at the same time. So, for example, if you're a retailer and you're trying to decide, should I go online? Well, the answer is you should always be online and offline because that's where your customers are. And what that means is not only that you should get into e-commerce, because clearly, and of course the pandemic has pushed us even further in that direction, but even bricks and mortar shopping is going to need to be much more of a hybrid experience where you may visit a physical store, but there's lots of digital stuff that's going on in that store, in the same way that work is going to be transformed, so that people after the pandemic, many people are not going to go back to offices 5 days a week. Maybe they're going to go back 2 days a week. And so, again, there's that recognition that our existence really going forward is constantly both online and offline.
Demographics still can work, though, can't they?
Well, they work as a first blush. They work to say, well, generally speaking, am I talking to young people or old people, or am I talking to people who live in warm climates or cool climates? At that level, it makes a lot of sense. But we've actually known for years that demographics is just the easiest way out, because demographics are variables that you can objectively measure. But the good stuff is the stuff that's harder to measure. That's the way life is. If it's more effective, it's probably harder to do. So we talk a lot about psychographics. We talk a lot about, within a demographic group, identifying strong differences in terms of psychographics. So you take two consumers, and let's say you have two men who are 30 years old. They live in downtown Sydney. They make the same income. Does that mean they're the same people? I doubt it. You have to look at how they're spending their leisure time, what their values are, etc. So to assume that all of your customers are the same because you've identified, let's say, an income group or a gender group is probably not going to be very productive in today's world.
That was customer engagement expert Michael Solomon. This episode of Business Essentials Daily is produced by the team at SoundCartel. Thanks for listening. I'm Nicole Goodman. We'll bring you more Be Daily tomorrow. Follow @BE Daily Podcast across social media and head to bedaily.com.au for more from the Business Essentials Daily podcast. SoundCartel. This episode was brought to you by Mazars. To find out more, visit mazars.com.au. That's mazars.com.au.